Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm your host Andrey, and I hope you're doing well today. We have with us Hanz. Hanz is a self-identified supporter of National Bolshevism, Eurasianism, and Strasserism, and we'll be discussing those subjects, and also to the sort of the as much as segments of the alt-right and National Socialism and white nationalism and traditionalism will often claim to be against modernity, but at the same time they still have sort of absorbed the same anti-communist and Russophobic narratives from the from the liberal and neocon and Zionists, for that matter, mainstream points of view that they claim allegedly, and I'm sure some of them do believe this, that they disagree with. Hans, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about you, Andrey?
Oh, just aggravating both the. You're making headways when both the alt-right and the SJWs dislike you. If you're not getting,
Right.
if you're not getting praise and or condemnation, then you're not making enough waves.
Yeah, then you're not doing it right.
Right, exactly. So let's start off. What as national well, Eurasianism in general and National Bolshevism in particular, and sort of Strasserism is sort of like a very similar connection to that. Because it gets condemnation, particularly from both the almost all segments of the West from the left and right. It's not an ideology that people pick up to make friends. What what was your point of view when you discovered it?
So, I mean, at one time I was I guess you would say I was a communist, and I really got sick of a lot of the anti-nationalistic rhetoric, and the rhetoric where they don't seem to care about the demographic changes happening in the West.
Right.
The fact that they can go around calling themselves communists or tankies or whatever they want to call themselves, and then they're kind of supporting some of the capitalistic decadence that infects our society right now.
Hmm. Well, what I
And
find interesting though is that they'll tend to support nationalism, or as they would say, national liberation struggles in the third world. And it's funny, they'll even support ones that are implicitly, even if they may not call themselves this, white nationalist liberation struggles. If the perception is that the white the if there's a struggle that has at least the image, rightly or wrongly, as being the third world or second world underdog that needs national liberation, it's funny, they'll almost sort of support it even if they have a lot of implicit white and or Christian nationalism. So for example, I know that the IRA is a national liberation struggle that is quote unquote okay with the contemporary Western left. Same as with the another one is the back in the day before there was an Armenian state, the Armenian national liberation struggle, and even now, funny enough, one thing that both the Eurasianist alt-right and SJWs seem to be somewhat supportive of is Novorossiya. So it's interesting that it seems that to win the support of the SJW left, you have to portray your struggle as being the third world underdog, and frankly, look as unwasp as possible. But at the same time, they don't grant the same right of national self determination through, for example, the whites in South Africa, obviously, or the white Christians in the West. But they will, they're very selective when they talk about so-called self-determination, aren't they?
yeah, and I've also kind of noticed this with Syria. I mean, you have a lot of people on the far left who support Assad, and I'm personally a supporter of Assad myself. And you also have a lot of people on the far right who seem to support him. And the view on the far left generally is that if they're non-white or something, it's like a struggle against imperialism. But if it's if it's like a more of a, I guess you could say a European or white movement, then it's it's not that.
Yeah.
But I mean, like the far right, I mean, they kind of support Assad more for ideological reasons. So I mean, I guess you could say Baathism is like a form of fascism. But the Baathists also call themselves, you know, the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party. So I mean, I guess you could see how some of the tankies would support them as well.
Right.
And ironically enough, you know, a lot of them seem to support, you know, the Kurds and Rojava. Meanwhile, the United States is funding the Kurds.
Yeah.
You know, so in a way, they're kind of like a tool of the imperialist U.S., which is somewhat hypocritical in my opinion that they support them. You know.
Oh, right. Well, obviously that's just your white privilege talking that you're calling them hypocrites for supporting them. I'm just kidding.
Right.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, it's so funny though that there's a whole hidden history that people, unless you're a political nerd like myself, of particularly after the Sino-Soviet split, that Maoists became so anti-Soviet that a lot of times they would actually, when there were these little proxy struggles all over the second and third world, or in some cases even in Western Europe, where the Maoists were so anti-Soviet that actually they would fight alongside U.S. backed proxies and mercenaries. Like they're but of course don't tell Jason on Rue that there's this history of in Latin America, Maoists and Hoxaists, that is to say those that are the follower of Enver Hoxha, that are fighting alongside Contras in Latin America, or the in Angola, the anti-communist Unity was what had many Maoists involved in it, and in fact was supported by, ironically enough, not just the West, but and apartheid South Africa, but also China. So there's this very, the SJWs, and particularly the Maoists, they have this whole hidden history of being, allegedly for the third world, people of color, et cetera, underdog. But in fact, they're very selective about when when they're critical of Western support.
Right, and the Maoists generally believe in something they call labor aristocracy. So they believe that, that the proletariat, as they call it, the worldwide proletariat, that the first world proletariat is actually more privileged than the third world proletariat, because, they live in more of a bourgeois society. And I'll actually say, even though I don't agree with their racial viewpoints,
right,
in a way, they're kind of right, because I mean, if you're a peasant, living in Africa, Asia, wherever, and you're struggling day to day for food, you may have more potential to actually, revolt, because you don't have those luxuries that you may have in the first world. And I'm not a third worldist by any means,
right.
but I mean, in a way, they do kind of have a point there. And I've wondered, if say the revolutions did happen in the third world first, I mean, would the dominoes fall? Would the U.S. empire start to kind of, lose its grasp on the world, and then would the revolution finally come here?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that, because there wasn't always, if you kind of look at the SJW left today, particularly, obviously, their whole nature of what they are, in my view, is sort of can be encapsulated perfectly with the debacle at Charlottesville. But there was a time, as recently as the 60s and 70s, where you could base the new left wasn't always these scumbags and social and cultural degenerates, and white Christian straight male guilt, etc. Like there was a time where they would lock arms with anybody that was anti-U.S. imperialist, even for completely different reasons than them. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Keith Preston, but when he was in the New Left in the 60s, it was, you could get basically those that were against the U.S. empire. you could get a coalition of, American Indians, blacks, the Appalachia, Southerners, the working class, and farmers of every race and religion. Basically, even if you were just against the U.S. empire, even for completely unrelated reasons, you could sort of form a sort of anti-imperialist coalition, which I kind of think, in a way, that was sort of the high day of U.S. politics in many ways.
Yeah, and another thing that's very irritating about the modern left is the fact that they'll often go around saying something like you're a stupid redneck if you don't agree with my progressive political views, and the people they're talking to, that they're talking to the actual working class, while most of them are usually middle class college students, maybe petite bourgeois, come from petite bourgeois families, and they're usually of that oppressive class. But what they do is they kind of change the narrative from class more to like race and things like that. Maybe it's the kind of because they're a part of that class. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's so weird that they'll, a lot of these people, I think it's because, and by the way, just to not sound completely unbiased, and of course I say that with a swastika and hammer and sickle flag behind me, but,
Right.
it's, I find it so interesting that a lot of, that these SJWs will talk about white privilege and etc., and yet they live in some of the most, and by the way, I don't think being affluent is in and of itself, suspect. But I kind of, I'm sorry, don't talk to me about white privilege and how evil capitalism is when a lot of these people, they have mommy and daddy paying for everything, which again is not bad in and of itself. But don't preach to me about white privilege or about stolen land or about evil capitalism when often they live in these completely safe, not just white but WASP, suburbanite, gated, ironically enough, communities, and get sort of paid, all expenses paid university, but yet I'm thinking to myself, in their own minds somehow they're not white privileged. Like, if you're so guilty about your white privilege, why don't you set the example and give up some of it to these sort of people of color that you say you claim you care about so much?
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, it's almost like they hate the working class, because they really hate, rural white people who may work in factories or things like that. I mean, they like the idea of the working class. They put it on a pedestal. But when it comes to actual working class people, they see them as racist, xenophobic, homophobic, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh yeah, and I mean it's so funny though. You made a good point. They almost put on they sort of have the slogans of working class and proletariat and peasant, etc. But in practice they are anything but. I mean, a lot of these people, working a job, and I'm not going to say that working in the restaurant industry or the working for minimum wage is great, but to somehow equate that as they themselves think it's the same as working, um, being a proletariat or a peasant in the second or third world, it is simply not correct. And I've spent about 6 months teaching English in Latin America, and the thing that I found interesting there is that a lot of times I think that they don't automatically have this sense of entitlement, and I know I'm getting off topic a bit, but they don't automatically have this sense of entitlement and white guilt. They might rightfully be critical of the U.S. empire, but frankly, who isn't? But I really do think that, like, what I found is that often the ones that will come to North America is they not the first generation, but often the second generation that has only known the prosperity of North America and don't know how good it is. They'll go through the university system, and then they'll get the white people owe us, the sense of entitlement. Whereas in their actual home countries, the people of the second and third world are naturally traditionalist.
Yeah, and Yeah, I mean, they basically go through universities and they get kind of the you know the social. I don't know. I don't even know if we call it an education, but yeah, I agree.
Yeah. What and the thing is too is I think that unfortunately, because most of the, I mean, particularly people living in the U.S. South, not all, but a lot of the Latin Americans, particularly Mexicans, they'll meet are ones that are the sort of the ones that are sort of the, frankly, the underclass and the bottom feeders, and so they'll get Mexico's worst of the worst, and then they'll get free education and be indoctrinated with how awful white people are, and then unfortunately this creates a negative image of like in other words, for a lot of people in the alt right, particularly in the U.S. and in the South, they'll think that the Mexicans that they encounter that are committing crimes and getting away with it are representation of all of the entire continent of Latin America.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, you're right. I mean, usually people who immigrate to another country, if they're from a struggling country, I mean, they're the types of people who aren't willing to actually fight for their country to make it better. So, I mean, you're definitely correct in that we get the worst of the worst, and the same definitely also applies to the the Muslim refugees that are coming to Europe right now. You
Right.
know, I mean, they're letting in millions of these, potentially radical refugees, and then they're having terrorist attacks every week, and they're wondering what's happening. Meanwhile, they toppled Gaddafi, and he was basically like the wall keeping them out of Europe, coming in from Africa. They topple him, and then they're wondering what's going on. Meanwhile, they're also trying to topple Assad. And you also have the Israelis involved in that too. The Israelis have been funding ISIS, and it's because they want to. I'm thinking they want to kind of expand Israel and kind of get the Greater Israel project going.
Oh yeah, and the thing is, what I find interesting though is that what kind of annoys me is that when you always hear this term, you don't hear it that much anymore, but oh, Syrian refugees, like very few. If you look at them and know anything about Syria at all, they're most of them are African, not even like North African, like Libyan. They're or Algerian. They're like like African, like quite frankly, Black African. And like
Sub-Saharan.
the thing is not that I'm saying I'd want more Muslim immigration, but if we got them at least from Syria or Iran or like in other words the Persian and Shia Muslims, they wouldn't be this huge cancer on the West that the African ones are. Like my thing that I find so funny is that a lot of the sections of, sorry, I guess you could say the alt right that will be critical of Islam but won't talk about the race question. They'll say, oh well, the only reason why they're acting this way is because they're Muslim. So in other words, if we allow in a bunch of refugees from the heart, so-called refugees from the heart of Africa, and they were Christian, somehow they would just naturally behave themselves.
Yeah, I mean they kind of ignore IQ statistics. I mean you can you can tell. I mean there's ways to tell there's differences in the races. I mean you have, like, for example, blacks are more likely to be you know have conditions like sickle cell anemia. There's certain conditions that affect races more than others, like certain uh, I guess you could say like diseases and things like that. And like everybody knows about the differences in IQ. Like, for example, East Asians usually have an IQ of 105. Europeans usually have an IQ of about 100. Sub-Saharan Africans usually have IQs around 80. And a
Right.
lot of people like to chalk that up to, oh, they're just poor. Oh, it's just a lack of education. But I mean, you can even go to some of the poorest white towns in America, like in Appalachia, places like that, and
Right.
those IQ statistics still are still about the same.
Hmm. Not just that, but I mean, you notice too, though, that for people that kind of take a more alt-right or libertarian view and say, well, it's all culture and economics. Well, I mean, part of if you go to like Appalachia or the South, even the not maybe the most affluent or wealthy parts, is that they're simply not on the same like. you don't get the same level of crime, of being unsafe. Like I've taught English in Colombia and Mexico, and honestly, I haven't felt like I felt safer there than I have in areas of so-called, diversity enriched Toronto. So the thing is, it can't be purely, oh well, it's only because they're poor that they're committing crime.
Right, and one thing I would like to point out is I do think economic factors do make some difference, but I don't totally take the economic stance, and I don't totally take the biological stance. I do think it is a mix of both. You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, and that's actually a good point you brought up there. Is that um, I think because the sort of the sort of libertarian view that it's all it's both the libertarian and the alt right, and I guess I shouldn't say that. I should say the race realist to be more specific. Is that they both have their strengths and weaknesses, but one weaknesses they both have is that they both have a very they're both very determinist, and they both have a very, oh, it's all race or it's all economics, or if you ask these sort of you know traditionalist, he might say, oh, it's all just the religion of the people, and it's a combination of those. Like
Yeah,
just because, for example, you know, like just because the certain states in the Congo were nominally Marxist-Leninists, just like the Soviet bloc, it doesn't mean at all that the African communist states were nearly as bearable to live in as, say, the Soviet Union or East Germany, as flawed and with its own problems those societies are.
yeah, that's definitely true. And both sides always seem to see things just totally, and no pun intended, in black and white. Like you have, the left, they see things on a purely materialist stance. The right, they see things on a purely biological stance. And I do believe it is a mix of both.
Right, exactly, and not just that, but I mean, often what happens too is that it sort of mentally, in a way, kind of mentally in a way, kind of mentally handicaps you from seeing, like, you have a very binary black and white, again, no pun intended, view of the world, and then often what ends up happening is that you don't know what to make of when other factors that don't fit into your worldview come into play. You just kind of dismiss them.
Well, yeah, I mean, on both sides, they both kind of reject, theory that may go against their worldview. Like, say, on the left, you'll never see somebody on the left, actually picking up something like Mein Kampf or something and reading it. And I'm not a Hitlerite, but
Right.
I'd still be open to reading it. And on the right, you'll never see them picking up the Communist Manifesto and reading it. And really, I think one of the best philosophers who really gives a good synthesis of some of those worldviews is George Sorel. You ever heard of him?
No, but I've heard of the name, but I don't know him specifically. Who was he?
So George Sorel, he was a French syndicalist back in the early 1900s,
Hmm.
and he kind of bounced around between nationalism and internationalism, and he wrote a lot about what he called myth and violence.
Okay.
And the Sorelian myth is essentially this idea that there one day there's going to be a great workers' strike, and it's like a form of propaganda. You take the great workers' strike and then you immortalize it in great paintings and art and propaganda, kind of like how Washington crossing the Delaware is kind of immortalized, in that image, and Mussolini, he actually took a lot of Sorel's ideas on propaganda and applied them to his fascist party.
Hmm.
And he talked a lot about violence and how the bourgeoisie, the what he called the parliamentary socialists, quote socialists, like the
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders types,
Yeah.
they'll talk about revolution one day, and then when there's the slightest hint that there may be some sort of violence that may threaten the bourgeoisie, they'll completely condemn it.
Oh yeah. I mean, they're or champagne socialist is a pretty good terminology. Like, they're so working class with they're so working class with their huge donors, and I mean, I think Bernie Sanders like never got a job until he was like 40 years old, and yet he's so where is he with interracial crime that's affecting not just affecting the white middle and working class areas that can't afford to leave where they're living, but also within the same within a lot of these same minority communities. Nope, it's all police brutality, and I'm not defending the police, but it's all police brutality. It's all white privilege. It's all etc. And it's in a way it almost kind of puts a stain on the much of the salvageable and even commendable aspects of the sort of classical Marxist and workers movement.
Right, and ironically, when Bernie Sanders first got in there, I don't know if you've seen some of his earlier interviews, but they were asking about immigration, and they said, "Are you for open borders, Mr. Sanders?" And he goes, "No, that inflates the labor market, and that's what the rich want, and blah blah blah." And then
Oh,
as
really?
he originally, yeah, and then as he got further and further into the primaries, he started towing the Democratic line more, because he had to appeal to those social justice minority groups because they basically shamed him into essentially making his message more and more liberal progressive, and I think that's also what may have lost him the election, because originally he had a good portion of the white working class on his side. They were his base. He got huge numbers in West Virginia, and then as he went on, he started to kind of abandon the white working class. At one point, he even said, if you're white, you don't know what it's like to be poor, and that's just a big load of BS. And I think that really screwed him over in the primaries.
Oh yeah, well it's interesting that it seems like a lot of these as soon as and this happens both on the left and right, is that a lot of times this sort of the politician says his most intense stuff often before it becomes mainstream, and then maybe this nature of the beast, hint hint, why we need to stop playing the politics game. Not that I'm entertaining violence, since I need to get on an airplane in a week and a half. But it's funny though that a lot of times the people that will are they, as soon as they become more mainstream, they water down and sort of play to their audience.
Right, and I'm not advocating violence either, but
Nope.
what a lot of people don't realize is violence, theoretically kind of underpins everything. When you go out and vote,
Yeah.
you're committing an act of violence against a minority, because if you win the vote, you're expecting the state to, enforce the, whatever law you voted for, whatever president you voted for, et cetera, et cetera. If you're in a job, and you get fired, you've had an act of economic violence levied against you, because you could essentially starve to death. Violence definitely underpins everything. The state itself is backed by violence. Whoever has the most guns determines who has rights. That's why I believe rights essentially are non-existent. We have privileges, and those privileges, or some might call them rights, are really only won through blood.
Right. Well, and the thing is, and again, can't stress this enough. Not that we're advocating violence, but the sad, unfortunate nature of just the world is that, I mean, as awful as violence and terrorism is, it does get results. I wish it weren't. I mean, I guess in my naivety, I wish I'd be able to sit down with SJWs or Black Lives Matter and sort of, if I can put it this way, libertarian our way out of these problems. But the thing is, you can't be nonviolent with people that are going to be violent with you. It's not it's not violence if somebody punches you, you punch them back, and the other person cries wolf. Like, the sad thing is that most which I can't condone, but most groups that engage in what we call, rightly or wrongly, terrorism, a lot of times, if you actually do a bit of homework about them, they got to that point because sort of peaceful elections and going through the system, etc., just wasn't working. And like very few, I'm not going to say all, but very few movements start off as being, hey, you know what, we have belief X, and to achieve our goal, let's go commit violence. Like, most people would just like to go to work, attend whatever religion that they adhere to, and enjoy their friends and family. And you know what? There's this issue in our community or country that needs to be addressed, and let's address it. But if it's just simply not being listened to by the powers that be, then unfortunately the status quo, often the only way to change it if it's intolerable is through force. And I wish that weren't the case, but it just kind of is the ugly nature of the beast.
Well, yeah, I mean, people get pushed to that point. I mean, you can look at the Trump election, all the all these reforms that Donald Trump said he was going to bring in, and he said he was going to stay out of Syria. Meanwhile, about 3 months into his presidency, he tomahawks some Syrian airfields. He talked about he did get rid of the TPP. I'll give him credit for that. But he said he was going to build a wall, and I don't. I mean, yeah, there are some deportations happening, and I give him credit for that as well. But I mean, it has been a bit of a disappointment. He hasn't really, gone through with a lot of the promises to his base, and he's also gotten rid of Steve Bannon. And even if he did want to institute some of those reforms, the Supreme Court wouldn't let it happen. Congress wouldn't let it happen. There's nothing you can really do within the current system if you're a politician or something like that.
Yeah, and the thing is, in a lot of ways, it doesn't we can always play the game of, is so and so sincere, and it's just the bureaucracy in the system that cripples and isolates them from doing it, or were they always were they always sort of an insider from the beginning? And I mean, like you can that's always an interesting conversation, but in a way, the argument of so and so good intentions, which unfortunately both the left and the right do, like those that vote, some of those that were sincerely anti-war left that voted for Obama would sort of pseudo justify him, not justify, explain away him, supporting proxies in Syria and Ukraine and Libya by, well, he is anti-war, but the CIA or the whatever the pro-war tendencies in the U.S. empire, which obviously exist, disable him from doing it. In a way, it kind of is it kind of is. I don't want to say pointless, but it's kind of like you never know what someone's intentions are. And number two, if the system won't even allow you to make the changes that, let's say, for the benefit of the doubt, Obama and Trump were sincere before they were elected, then in a way it doesn't matter what somebody's intentions are, because the system, even if you want to be liberty-minded and anti-war, will simply not allow you to be, even if you want to give these people the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, I mean, people talk about the deep state a lot, and it is real. What it essentially is it's like a business partnership between large arms manufacturers, the CIA, the NSA, all these secretive organizations, and they don't want these wars to end. It's like Trump. He talked about ending his aggressions against Russia, and then this whole manufactured Russia controversy comes up. To try to to where if he says he doesn't want aggressions with Russia, well, oh, Russia must have hacked the elections.
Yeah, well, you know what? I mean, I don't know. I assume you're living in the States, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that the thing is, a lot of so much of like the coverage of the US we get in Canada is just, to me, like it's just theater. And I'm not saying like, they're all actors and none of it's real. I'm not trying to go all Alex Jones here, but it's just so like repetitive and predictable, and like, the sort of mainline Republicans, everyone's a socialist to disagree with them. The Democrats, everyone's a racist. I guess, for me, given my flags, I'm a bit of both, so nobody likes me. But it seems like it's just so. The fact that what's scary to me is that so many people like get so into it that it's kind of frightening to me how many people will still like unconditionally be pro-Republican, or unconditionally be pro-Democrat, and they'll defend their team, as it were. And I'm not going to say that I'm guilty of this sometimes. That they'll defend their team even if they're doing things that, if it was the opposing party or allegedly opposing party, they would condone. So, for example, like I remember when when the Syrian strike happened, and I had to condone it. I had to condemn it. Um, Even though I was sort of a Trump supporter with some, or a critical Trump supporter, I had some reservations about him. But I remember hearing like a lot of people that were sort of more alt-right, Trump forever supporters, like trying to rationalize it and like, oh well, no one died or not that many people died. But if it was Obama still in office or Hillary Clinton, they would condemn it, and rightly so.
Yeah, definitely. And I've heard a lot of them even say things like, "Oh well, Assad's a Muslim, so he deserves it," even though he's completely secular and he's actually suppressing radical Islam in the region.
Yeah, not just that, but I think it's sort of a warped irony that I wonder if now that the Middle East is sort of emptying their underclass. Well, I mean, most of the refugees are from Africa, but because the Middle East is sort of emptying out the worst of their worst, going to Europe. It almost seems like now in a lot of ways that in some cases it's actually safer to be a Christian or a minority Muslim group in certain parts of the Middle East than it is in the West now. And I don't say that with any joy.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, because I mean, in the Middle East, I mean, Christians they do get beheaded and things like that. But I suppose if you're like in a portion of the Middle East that's controlled by, say a Ba'athist party like Assad, yeah, you'd be relatively safe. But yeah, in Europe, yeah, Christians are, very much persecuted.
Right. Well, and also the thing is too is that I think that a lot of times people will get mad at the fact that Africa or the Middle East or Latin America are they're underclass, and not even, I shouldn't say underclass, but they're criminals, and their worst of their worst are going to the West, and yet a lot of people the right in general, they're mad at these other continents for them leaving. It's like, look, if I kick somebody out of my house, Hans, and they go into your house and cause problems, it's not my fault that you decided to take him in.
Yeah, definitely. And Angela Merkel, I mean, she's brought a lot of these people in, and the entire EU is essentially, I mean, I hate to even use this term, but it's almost like an economic Fourth Reich, and she's now trying to punish Eastern European countries, that don't want to bring in these immigrants. And Germany has an older population that's dying, and how does she fix it? She doesn't encourage the German people to have more children. She just brings in more immigrants, and the reason for that is because the European Union is essentially it's like a large consolidation of capital, and it's very profitable to bring these people in because it inflates the labor market, and it's cheap labor. That's what it is.
Oh yeah, and not just that, but it's funny that a lot of the people that are still like dying the wool anti-communist, they'll often not sort of wonder what is it about Eastern Europe that they're just simply resistant to the flood of refugees, and and I honestly and they just don't buy this white guilt stuff. They just honestly don't. And it's funny, a lot of them will not kind of figure out, well, gee, what is it? What's the main difference between East and Western Europe? Well, up until the late '80s, one good side. I'm not going to defend the command economies of the Soviet bloc in and of themselves. But one good thing about the Iron Curtain is that it did, in a way, it was almost like an iron shield. It shielded the Eastern Europe and Russia from the degeneracies of the Western left. But unfortunately, that's kind of lost on the people that are sort of dying the whole anti-communist, and I guess it's much more prevalent in the United States than anywhere else in the West, is that the idea that there's anything defensible about the Soviet bloc or the communist or a communist system is just beyond the pale if you're on the right.
Well, I mean, you can also look at the immigration numbers between East Germany and West Germany. I mean, East Germany had far lower levels of immigration than West Germany did, and West Germany brought in a lot of Turkish immigrants, and now Turkish immigrants are the number one minority in Germany. So I mean, what's that tell you? I mean they took more of an economic stance on it. Like they didn't explicitly say we're not going to let them in because they're this race or that race, but they kind of said, we're not going to let in all these people because that's gonna inflate our labor markets, and that's gonna maybe even cause some less cultural cohesion, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Well, and actually, what's interesting too is that the case. It's funny that even in the Eastern Germany tends to be. I'm thinking of Dresden particularly. Is that tends to be the main base of the German nationalist resistance in Germany tends to be the East. And even it's funny. Even some of the self-identify. By the way, anyone listening to this, I'm not using the word communist in a very overgeneralized Broadway. I'm using it like parties that self-describe themselves as communists. In a lot of East Germany and the rest of the Soviet bloc, many of the older communist parties that are still around are actually they're socialist in their economics, but they're still very nationalistic. Like they don't want this rising tide of color into their countries.
Well, interestingly enough, this kind of goes back to the 20s and 30s with the founding of the National Bolshevik movement under Ernst Niekisch. He at one time he was a communist, and he traveled to the Soviet Union, and he saw the Soviet command economy, the Soviet militarism, and he thought, this seems very compatible with Prussian nationalism, Prussian militarism. Maybe we should kind of bring this back here, and a lot of the progressives who talk about national liberation of different colored peoples or whatever. Ernst Niekisch in a way was kind of the founder of these national liberation movements, because in Germany he saw the bourgeoisie who were going along with the Treaty of Versailles. He saw them as inherently anti-nationalistic, and he saw National Bolshevism as a national liberation movement.
Well, right, yeah, exactly. And the thing is that what's interesting that actually goes back to more of these sort of the before the National Socialists came to power in Germany, there was actually and unfortunately Hitler and the SS and the Nordicist Slavophobic, etc., like very anti-Russia and anti-communist wing of the National Socialist movement won out, obviously, but there was actually a wing. Not just I don't know if Ernst. You can correct me on this. I don't know if Ernst Nietzsche was actually part of the National Socialist movement as such, but there were definitely some those in the National Socialist movement prior to Hitler coming to power that saw the Soviet Union, particularly since it had become a pariah state after World War One, like the Germany had become. They saw eastward was Germany's true ally, and that the Atlanticist powers were German. The Atlanticist power. There was no reason why, if you're a German nationalist, why you should see the Soviet Union as your enemy and the Atlanticist power. But you can almost just say Britain, because U.S. was still isolationist then. See the Atlanticist powers, particularly Britain, as your ally. And I think my personal view of I think that was one of the biggest reasons for the fall of the Third Reich was that they were so ideologically uncompromising on their Anglophilia and Russophobia that it didn't matter how many overtures the Kremlin made to kind of coexist and sort of work with, sort of making sure that the Third Reich's foreign policy, as long as it didn't intrude on the territory of the Soviet Union, very much tried to coexist coexist with the Third Reich on Europe. And at the same extreme, it didn't matter how many it didn't matter how aggressive the British Empire was. There was just this constant like, oh well, the British are Nordic like us and they're anti-communist like us. Maybe we can always be willing to make a deal with them, and that I think is one of the biggest reasons, the biggest foreign policy misconceptions the Third Reich had.
Well, Churchill, I mean, he totally wanted war. He totally wanted to completely destroy Germany socially, economically, militarily. And interestingly enough, after Germany lost the war, you know, when the Russians came in, they didn't totally destroy the German national identity. Like if you look at some of the like if you look at the East German army, I mean, they still had that element of Prussian nationalism, and I think one of your other guests mentioned this in one of your other shows. Basically, they kind of said to the Germans, well, it's the German people didn't do anything wrong. You were taken in by National Socialism. Whereas in the western half of Germany, they kind of said, well, it's your fault, and you need to totally destroy your national identity. And the Russians did a much better job of preserving German national identity, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, not only that, but it's very much swept under the rug by the sort of the not just the right in the West in general, but also even segments of the alt-right. It's starting to be. To be completely fair, there's certain sections like Matt Heimbach of the Trad Workers Party, and even there are some elements of the alt-right that are pro-Russia and Putin friendly that don't take such a uncompromising, hard anti-communist and anti-Soviet view. But yeah, you're right. Generally speaking, that sort of side of the story is often either not known, genuinely not known, or people don't want to acknowledge it because it screws up their doctrinaire anti-communist worldview.
Yeah, and Richard Spencer has even said things like, "Oh, it was completely honorable to serve in the Soviet army." He said something about wearing a Soviet helmet or something. I don't remember the exact quote, but whenever he says something like this, his fans get all excuse my French, but get all pissy, and
Yeah.
start saying, "Oh, well, you're just a filthy communist and this and that." And I think Richard Spencer, even though I don't agree with him on everything, I think he's definitely read a lot of theory, even if he doesn't always articulate it well. I think he's read the Communist Manifesto. He's probably read some Ebola, things like that. So, I respect anybody, even if I don't agree with them ideologically, if they've at least read some theory. Like Steve Bannon, ironically, he said, "I'm a Leninist. I want to completely deconstruct the state." And if you read Lenin's State and Revolution, that's half of what Lenin is talking about. That's the part of it I don't agree with. I agree with his portion about vanguardist parties completely suppressing the bourgeoisie, but yeah, you can tell which segments of the right have read theory and which are just basically spouting helicopter memes. Oh, you're gonna get thrown out of a helicopter if you're slightly to the left of anything hard right economically.
Oh yeah, and the thing is too is that what I find interesting though is that often the sections of, like, I'm not going to demonize everybody, but sections of the alt right very often they have the same. What happened to just, and I guess maybe this makes me old, but what happened to just having a disagreement with somebody? Why does everyone that you disagree with, and obviously the SJWs and the neocons do this too, but it's like, a lot of times I think so, particularly not these sort of David Duke, Jared Taylor, like Richard Spencer, sort of the older generation, and Matt Heimbach definitely doesn't do this either, but I know some of the younger ones that, they anything they disagree with is Judeo-Bolshevism. It's like they watch the film like Hellstorm, by I don't know if you've seen that by like a Renegade Broadcasting, and then that's their whole like worldview, and they will not even entertain any. It's the equivalent, in my view, of anything the SJWs dislike makes you a fascist and a Nazi. Like unfortunately, some of the sections of the alt right, particularly the younger generation, they've almost become a sort of, they're almost like, the way they sort of denounce anything they disagree with instead of actually dealing with it is almost like they still have the mindset of an SJW, but with sort of white nationalism replacing white guilt.
Yeah, it's an inherently reactionary worldview. I hate anti-communists just as much as I hate anti-fascists.
Yeah.
And they, it's it makes it easier to dismiss an argument when you can just put it in like a little box, you know.
Well, right, exactly, and it's just well, not just that, but it's almost like intellectually lazy. Like it's just it's a very you don't want to have your worldview challenged because God forbid. So you just outright dismiss it as being, oh, you're a this or that. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with renegade broadcasting.
I'm not.
Okay, so anyway, um, it's headed. I'm not going to drop any names, but people who probably know who I'm referring to. Um, they initially produced some pretty good material about the white genocide in South Africa. Not that I think apartheid was a sustainable system, obviously, but they did a pretty good job about that. They did this film Hellstorm, and it's interesting. The author of it was a man by Thomas Goodridge, um, and they'll take this. They took this documentary that's based on the book of the same name, Hellstorm, and it went from being like Thomas Goodridge. He was the first to say when he gets interviewed. He was on Red Ice Radio. He was the first one to say that I'm not trying to overly romanticize the German or the Axis side, and then overly demonize the Western or Soviet side in World War II. Like he concedes that war is shitty, and every both the winners and the losers commit atrocities, but he points out the difference between the more European and Slavic members of the Soviet army were much more I'm not going to say they were cupcakes, but or butterflies, but they're much more civil with how they treated occupied Germany after 1945. Whereas a lot of the rapes that are contributed to Soviet soldiers, they were not. I mean, they were Soviet soldiers, but they were the more Mongolian and East Asiatic, and frankly non-white members of the Soviet army, and that most of and not all the commissars were telling Soviet soldiers to go rape. Most of them were Jewish commissars that, rightly or wrongly, had an axe to grind against the whole German population. But the way the film is made, Hellstorm, it was sort of turned into the Russians or the people from the East, like as if everyone who was under German occupation that pushed back had no legitimate grievance against anything about Germany. That it was all the atrocity stories. And I'm not going to lie that a lot of them are manipulated and exaggerated. All of them are fake. Like none of them are real. It's all, and if you believe that, well, you've been taken in by Judeo-Bolshevik propaganda.
Well, interestingly enough, you're talking about Jewish party elites in the Soviet Union. You know, a lot of people on the right, they like to say, oh well, Stalin, he was just a Jew puppet or something like that. When interestingly enough, he actually purged a lot of those elements from the Soviet Union. And have you ever heard of the Doctor's Plot?
Oh, you mean the purging of so-called cosmopolitans and Zionists in the 1950s? No, I've never heard of that.
Right. No, but the Doctor's Plot, basically there was, Stalin, like a week before he died, he said that, Zionists are trying to kill me, and then he died a week later. And the theory is that, Jewish doctors may have actually poisoned Stalin. And, after Stalin died, that was all just swept under the rug, and they kind of went back to, bringing some of those party members back,
Well, that to me just sounds like you're espousing anti-Semitism, and I don't know what about me you think that I'm not sensitive towards that.
Right.
Sorry, I got to throw some humor in there when we're covering some pretty intense stuff, but yeah, it's funny though that going back to when you have sort of a doctrinal worldview is that they'll make a big deal about allegedly Lenin and Stalin were partially Jewish, right? But then or the fact that the Soviet Union defended Israel in at least the early stages of it being established, right? But then they'll completely overlook the fact that, as you said before, the fact that most of the early purges when Stalin and the National Bolsheviks although I don't know if they ever called themselves that, the National Bolshevik wing of the original Bolshevik Party was coming to power in after the revolution, is that they'll never point out the purging of the Trotskyists. They'll never talk about the Doctor's plot, and they'll never mention that the Frankfurt School themselves, not what I think, because I'm crazy, what do I know? The Frankfurt School themselves actually said, in their words, not mine, that the reason why they sort of turned on the Soviet Union and on the working class in the West in general is because they saw that one, their sort of pet project, the USSR, was reviving elements of nationalism and traditionalism, and how dare they? And also too that the fact that the working class was voting for the nationalistic parties in Western Europe, and that the sort of the Moscow loyal communist parties were being directed from the Kremlin to coexist to the extent that they can with many of the nationalistic and quote unquote fascistic parties. That's why the Frankfurt School decided to focus on the class or group of people that was going to make the revolution wasn't going to be the proletariat anymore. It was going to be the farmers and the people of color. In their words, not mine.
I'm not super familiar with the Frankfurt School. I mean, I know the stories behind it, but have you ever watched a interview between Richard Spencer and Jonathan Bowden on the Frankfurt School?
I want to say yes, but yeah, but Jonathan Bowden he kind of pointed out the irony that he acknowledges there was a major change in the Marxist left after World War II, correct?
It's been a while since I've seen the interview, but I mean, from what I remember, I mean, I heard Jonathan Bowden saying that in kind of a weird way that Adorno had actually you know, a lot of his theories were on music, and he had actually condemned like genres like jazz and things like that because he saw them as like being inherently bourgeois. I know a lot of people like to say like the Frankfurt School was like inherently anti-Western and pro-degeneracy, but I mean, from what I know about it, just based on that interview, like I've heard like almost the opposite.
Really? Oh, I
Yeah,
didn't know that. Oh, okay.
yeah. I mean,
Wait.
oh, I'm sorry. I was just gonna say, yeah, you should check out that interview between Spencer and Bowden. It's really good.
Well, the thing is, what I noticed too, though, it seems like a lot of the SJW left now, it's mostly millennials who they'll like they either are just too intellectually lazy. That's not to say the alt sections of the alt right don't have this as well. Is that they're intellectually lazy and they don't want to do the homework of finding out. Like they almost kind of like the Antifa and the skinheads are almost mirror images of each other. Of they like the shock and awe imagery, but they often will not either not want to know or just not care to know the history and the symbology behind it.
Right, and I get some flack from this, from like some communists and things, but like like if somebody puts a label on themselves, like say somebody calls themselves a fascist or something like that, I'm not gonna totally dismiss their arguments because they call themselves a fascist. Just like I'm not gonna totally dismiss somebody's arguments if they call themselves a communist. I mean, in reality, I mean, you can sometimes find some crossovers between like some of the hardline, tanky types and some of the hardline, fascist types.
Well, the thing is that isn't the term tanky itself kind of a SJW Trotskyite Maoist like smear of being anyone who is like tanky obviously derived from the word tank. Isn't it kind
Right.
of implying that oh, you support the methods of the Soviet bloc because the Soviet bloc were like fascists? Isn't it sort of like a new left pejorative term for those that defend the Soviet Union?
Yeah, I mean that's it is, among some anarchist circles. Yeah, it kind of is, but I mean, I kind of use it as a badge of honor almost.
Well, yeah. Well, the thing is, though, it's a little more. It's a little more like people that know what it means know what it means, but at the same time, um, it's not as like you're probably less likely to be. It's like the word Eurasianist. It doesn't have a sour taste in someone's mouth as the term National Bolshevik would. It's a
Right.
little. It's kind of it's edgy enough, but it's not. It doesn't carry so much weight as saying Nazi or Bolshevik.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like I've I've heard some people call themselves fascists, spout some very some very anti-capitalist rhetoric, and I've heard some people who call themselves tankies actually support some fascist movements like we were talking about earlier with Assad and the Baathists, and that's kind of that crossover that you can often have. Like, look at the ideology of Juche, for example. I mean, it's very nationalistic. But it's also very socialistic, and people like to use the term red fascist as an insult. Well, I mean, I don't personally take that as an insult.
Right. Yeah, yeah. It's almost like I almost kind of wonder if the term if terms like Nazbol or Eurasianist start becoming popular, it's almost like we have to kind of almost throw the accusation of, oh, what, are you too much of a cuck to be called a national Bolshevik? Like, it's almost like you kind of have to use some of the alt-right anti-communist sort of smears against them. Like you're too much of a pussy to be seen with like a national Bolshevik flag.
Right. And another thing they like to do, they kind of like to do the same thing. They'll say, oh,
Sorry,
why not?
sorry, who's they? Who are we referring to now?
I'm mostly talking about like the alt right.
Oh,
If you support like some nationalistic and socialistic rhetoric, they'll say, well, why not just call yourself a national socialist? Well, the thing is, I mean, a lot of so-called national socialists aren't really national socialists at all, and you get like a lot of degenerate skinhead types in that movement, and maybe it's something you don't want to be associated with, so you lean more towards the National Bolshevism or the Strasserism or social nationalism. I mean, I personally would call myself more or less a social nationalist, because I take influences from a lot of different, thinkers. I take some influences from Sorel, I take a few from Strasser, I take a few from Ernst Niekisch.
yeah. The thing is, what I find interesting though, particularly with a lot of the, obviously World War II and American Civil War, sorry, war between the states. I can see a Southern patriot, correcting me on this right now. But a lot of the revisionism when it comes to the war between the states or World War II is that a lot of the people, they'll be open to revisionism about the so-called American Civil War or the World Wars, but for some reason, when it comes to the Cold War, in that case, and only that case, the status quo of the Atlantis' powers in the West in general, they were telling the truth about the enemy then. But before, when it was the Confederacy or the Axis, they were lying. But for some reason, the second it becomes 1946, then that enemy that the Western establishment was warning its populations about, that enemy is real. But then the second it hits 1992 and there's no more Soviet, well, okay, I forget if it was 91 or 92, the Soviet bloc ended. But then the Middle East, then they started lying again. So for some reason, they'll be so historical revisionist, except when it comes to the communism. Then they're not open to it at all.
Yeah, they take the liberal propaganda hook, line, and sinker, and really, I mean, the Western policy in a way, it was just to kind of oppose anything that may be a threat to Western liberal democracy. And if you look at the actual term liberalism, what that refers to to the post Enlightenment movement of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, where the merchant class actually replaced the aristocracy. So a lot of libertarians, they actually are liberals. Meanwhile, they're going around calling everybody they don't like a liberal.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.